She's nothing but a worthless daughter. That is what Sandra Holt said in open court, in front of a judge, in front of attorneys, in front of a bailiff standing by the door. She said it in a flat voice with no tremor, no shame, the way someone reads a line off an invoice. And the woman she said it about was standing 3 feet away in a United States Army dress uniform, captain's rank on her shoulders, 12 years of service ribbons above her left breast pocket, not moving a single muscle. That moment is where this story ends. But to understand what it took to get there, you have to go back to the beginning. Rachel Holt grew up in a 2-story house on the east side of Peoria, Illinois, in a neighborhood where the yards were small and the garages were full, and most of the fathers on the block worked in manufacturing. Her father Gary spent 30 years at a defense parts plant running machining equipment, the kind of work that gets into your hands and stays there. Her mother Sandra taught 2nd grade at a public elementary school for 26 years. They were not dramatic people. They were not wealthy people. They paid their bills on time, had opinions about everything, and expressed love mostly through logistics, making sure there was food, making sure there was a ride, making sure the practical things got handled. Feeling in the Holt house was largely implied. Rachel was 17 when her high school's ROTC program held a commissioning ceremony for a graduating senior, and something in her went quiet in a way that felt like recognition rather than surprise. It was not a dramatic moment from the outside. She just watched and understood, and by the end of that school year she had made a decision that would structure the next 17 years of her life. She enrolled at a university with a strong ROTC program, pursued a pre-law track, went to law school, passed the bar, and was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the United States Army JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General's Corps, the branch that handles the military's legal work. Contracts, administrative law, command counsel, legal assistance for service members, advising commanders on disciplinary proceedings and deployment orders, and everything in between. Quiet work, largely invisible work, but work the institution cannot function without. She served her first posting in Georgia, her second in Germany, and eventually landed at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio, Texas, where she had been assigned for the last 4 years. By 34 she was a captain with 12 years of service, a performance record that spoke for itself, and a desk covered in files that never seemed to get smaller. She was not unhappy. She was exactly where she had chosen to be. 3 years before the courtroom, at 31, Rachel bought a condo in the Stone Oak neighborhood of San Antonio. 2 bedrooms, 3rd floor, a small balcony facing west. VA loan, 30-year mortgage, purchase price $305,000. The down payment just over $60,000. She had saved herself over 7 years, setting aside a fixed amount from her base pay every single month. Through 2 overseas postings and 1 deployment, and every month in between. No co-borrower on the loan. No contribution from her parents, no transfer, no help of any kind. The title was in her name alone because she had paid for it alone, the way she had built everything else in her adult life. The day she signed the closing documents, she drove to her empty condo, stood in the middle of the living room with bare walls and the smell of fresh paint, and stayed there for a while in the quiet. Then she called her mother. She was not calling for a celebration exactly. She just wanted to tell someone. Sandra listened and then said, "That's a lot of debt, Rachel." That was the whole conversation. Some people have parents who meet every achievement with warmth. Rachel had parents who met every achievement with an accounting. She had stopped waiting for something different years before that phone call. But the specific silence after "that's a lot of debt" after 7 years of saved paychecks and a signed deed with her name on it had a weight that stayed with her longer than she expected. She put her phone away, went back to looking at her walls, and started thinking about paint colors. That was how she handled most things. You registered it, you set it down, and you moved forward. It had served her well for 12 years. For a while longer, she believed it always would. The first signal came in September on a Wednesday night, late enough that Rachel was already in bed with a brief she had been reading since 8. Her mother's name on the screen was not unusual. Sandra called most weeks, generally to report on the neighbors or the weather or whatever the school board had done that she disagreed with. Rachel answered, and they talked about nothing for a few minutes, and then Sandra said, almost as an aside, "The condo, that's just in your name, right? You didn't put anyone else on it?" Rachel said yes. Just her name, no co-borrower. Sandra said okay, just curious, and moved on to something else. Rachel did not think about it after she hung up. It registered as the kind of question a parent asks when they are trying to understand a world that works differently from the one they grew up in. She filed it and forgot it. The October call was stranger because it was Gary. Gary almost never called on his own. In the normal order of things, Sandra handled all communication with Rachel, and Gary existed somewhere in the background of those conversations, occasionally audible if Sandra put the phone on speaker. But one afternoon in the third week of October, Rachel's phone rang, and it was her father's number. She picked up and he asked without much preamble how large her mortgage payments were each month. She told him the figure. There was a pause, and then he said, "I see," and then he said he had to go, and he hung up. Rachel sat with her phone for a moment after that. It was an odd call. Gary had never once in her adult life asked about her finances. She turned it over a few times, decided he was probably just worrying in his quiet way, and let it go. In December they came in person. It was the first visit in nearly 3 years, Gary and Sandra making the drive down from Peoria, a long 2 days each way. Rachel cleaned the condo the weekend before, did a full grocery run, made a pot of chili and a pan of cornbread, and bought a chocolate cake from the bakery down the street. She wanted it to feel like something. They arrived Saturday afternoon with a cooler and 2 bags, Sandra carrying a tin of Christmas cookies she had made herself. They came inside and Sandra moved through the rooms the way she moved through every new space, purposeful, evaluative, touching the countertops, opening the hall closet, standing at the balcony door, and looking out at the view for longer than seemed casual. Eventually, she said, "It's a nice place, Rachel." Coming from Sandra, that was not a small thing. Rachel accepted it as the compliment it was. After dinner, when the plates were cleared and Gary was nursing a second cup of coffee, Sandra asked if she could take a look at the paperwork on the condo. Just to understand how it all worked, she said. She had never bought property herself, and she was curious about the process. Rachel went to the filing cabinet in the second bedroom and brought out the folder, the loan documents, the title deed, the closing disclosure, the payment schedule. She handed it over without a second thought. Sandra put on her reading glasses and went through it carefully, page by page. After a few minutes, she noted almost to herself that Rachel had no co-borrower on the loan. Rachel said that was right, her income had qualified her on her own. Sandra nodded and kept reading. Across the table, Gary was looking at the surface of the kitchen table. Not at his coffee, not at Sandra, not at Rachel. At the table. Rachel noticed it and felt nothing particular about it. He was tired from the drive. He was quiet the way he had always been quiet. She got up to refill the water glasses. They left Sunday morning after breakfast. Sandra hugged her at the door, brief, a little stiff, the kind of hug that means the right thing even if it does not quite feel like it. Gary shook her hand. Not the way a father shakes a daughter's hand. The way you shake someone's hand at the end of a meeting when the important part is already done. Rachel closed the door and stood in her quiet condo. She washed the last few dishes, dried them, put them away. The place looked the same as it always did. Everything was in order. And yet something sat at the edge of her awareness that she could not name, not worry, not suspicion, something thinner than both of those. She told herself she was tired. She told herself the visit had gone fine. She put the folder back in the filing cabinet and went to bed. Both of those things were true. Neither of them was the whole story. The call came on a Thursday evening in February while Rachel was standing in her kitchen waiting for the kettle to boil. The woman who called was someone Rachel had known her whole life, a neighbor of her parents in Peoria. A friend of Sandra's going back decades. The kind of woman who felt uncomfortable keeping things to herself when she thought someone had a right to know. She opened the conversation by saying she hoped Rachel would not take this the wrong way. Then she said what she had to say. Sandra had been telling people around Peoria that the San Antonio condo had been a family purchase. That the Holts had all saved together. That Gary and Sandra had contributed to it. The neighbor had pushed back. Rachel's a JAG officer, she earned that on her own, but Sandra had held her position without any apparent discomfort. It had come up more than once. Rachel thanked her, kept her voice steady, and stayed on the call long enough for it not to feel abrupt. After she hung up, she did not move for a while. The kettle finished boiling and she did not touch it. Outside, the streetlight at the edge of her parking lot flickered at irregular intervals, not quite broken. Not quite working. She watched it through the kitchen window and thought about what it meant that her mother had been saying this and how long she might have been saying it and to how many people. She called Sandra the next morning before she left for post. She was calm and direct. Those were deliberate choices, not natural ones. She asked her mother plainly whether she had been telling people the condo was purchased with family money. Sandra's answer came without much pause. "We put everything into you, your whole life, Rachel. You think raising a child doesn't cost anything? Rachel said what was true, that providing for a child is a legal obligation, not a financial contribution toward a property purchased by that child at 31 with 7 years of her own savings. Sandra's voice shifted into something harder. You're always like this. Everything by the book, nothing by the heart. Then she ended the call. Rachel stood in her kitchen with her phone and ran through the most charitable explanation she could construct. Her mother was frustrated. Her mother had always been frustrated in one way or another by the specific shape Rachel's life had taken: the military, the distance, the absence of the things Sandra had expected by now. The lie in Peoria was probably an expression of that frustration, something that had gotten out of hand. It would run its course. She filed it in the same place she filed everything else and went to work. She was wrong about that. She knew it by March. The envelope was in her mailbox on a Friday evening when she got home from post, thick manila with a Peoria return address and a law firm name in the upper left corner. She took it upstairs, set it on the kitchen counter, and opened it with the kind of deliberate slowness that is not calm but performs calm while the mind is already working ahead. Inside was a formal demand letter, 4 pages, correctly structured. It cited Texas property law. It cited the doctrine of unjust enrichment. Gary and Sandra Holt were asserting a legal right to 50% of the Stone Oak condo on the grounds that they had contributed funds toward its purchase. They were giving Rachel 30 days to respond voluntarily before proceeding to litigation. She called Jess Navarro that night. Jess was her closest friend from law school. They had met in their first-year contracts class and had stayed close through everything since. Through Jess leaving the Army after 3 years to open a civil practice in San Antonio. Through all of it, Jess read the scanned letter and called back 40 minutes later. Her assessment was direct by substance. The parents had nothing. Rachel had purchased the condo before marriage with fully documented personal funds on a VA loan in her name alone. There was no legal basis for a claim of shared ownership. But if the parents had any document suggesting a transfer of funds had occurred, even a document that could be challenged, it would generate litigation work regardless of the underlying merit. The question was whether they had anything. Rachel spent the rest of that night building her file. 7 years of federal tax returns. 7 years of military pay statements. The savings account history showing the down payment accumulating month by month. The VA loan documents. The full payment history from closing to present. Every dollar traced to its source in chronological order in a binder with labeled tabs. It was the kind of work she did professionally, and doing it kept her from thinking too carefully about what it meant that she was doing it for this reason. 30 days passed. She did not call, did not write, did not propose any settlement or voluntary resolution of any kind. On day 32, a notice arrived from Bexar County District Court. Gary and Sandra Holt had filed a civil complaint. The claim was for 50% interest in the property at her address in Stone Oak. The stated basis was a promissory note for $80,000 allegedly signed by Rachel Holt, stating she had received those funds from her parents as a loan toward the purchase of the condo. Rachel read that sentence twice. Then a third time slowly. A promissory note. Signed by her. For $80,000. She set the notice down on the table and looked at it the way you look at something sitting exactly where it should not be. There had been no loan. There had been no $80,000. There had been no conversation about either of those things, not once, not in any form. Which meant the note they were describing did not come from her. And yet, according to a civil complaint filed in a Texas court, it existed. Jess's office was on the 2nd floor of a building near the Pearl District, 3 rooms, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a coffee maker that ran all day. Rachel had been there before for small professional matters. That morning felt different from the moment she walked in. Jess had already pulled the complaint from the court's electronic filing system and printed the attachments. The promissory note was in a separate folder on the desk. Rachel picked it up and read it standing. The document was dated 3 years back, 1 month before her closing date. It stated that Rachel and Holt had received $80,000 from Gary and Sandra Holt as a loan toward the purchase of residential property. The language was serviceable, not sophisticated, but correct enough to hold its shape in a filing. At the bottom was her name printed, and below that her signature. She looked at it for a long time. Not because she was uncertain, because she was making sure she was seeing exactly what she thought she was seeing. 12 years in the JAG Corps means 12 years of signing your name to documents that matter: orders, contracts, legal opinions, sworn statements, administrative records. You develop a signature the way you develop a handwriting, the pressure of the pen, the angle of the letters, the specific way a loop closes. The signature on the promissory note was close. Someone had studied hers and tried. But the terminal stroke on the capital H was wrong, a small detail barely visible, the kind of thing that would mean nothing to anyone who was not her. It meant everything to her. She set the document on Jess's desk and said, "That is not my signature." Not as a question, as a fact. Jess nodded. They talked through next steps, a private forensic handwriting examination initiated immediately using a certified examiner with court-accepted credentials. Rachel would provide clean signature samples from dated JAG documents. In the meantime, she needed to pull together every financial record that touched the condo from the first day she started saving. She spent that afternoon at Jess's office and went home in the early evening. After dinner, she opened her bank's app and requested a full statement on her mortgage account, the complete history going back to origination. It came through as a document around 9 o'clock. She opened it on her laptop at the kitchen table and started reading. Every payment was there, every monthly transfer from her checking account to the loan servicer, clean and unbroken. She was on the third page when she stopped. 8 months earlier, in the spring of the previous year, someone had accessed her mortgage account. The record showed it clearly, an inquiry submitted in person at a branch location authorized by a notarized power of attorney. The name on the power of attorney was Cody Holt. She had to think for a moment before she placed him. Gary's nephew's son, one generation further out. She had met him twice, maybe 3 times, at family gatherings in Peoria years ago. He had been finishing some kind of certificate program the last time she had seen him. Claims adjusting or something adjacent to insurance. She knew almost nothing about him. What she knew with complete certainty was that she had never given him power of attorney over any of her financial accounts. She had never given anyone that authorization. It was the kind of thing she would remember because it was the kind of thing she would never do. She called Jess at 10:53. Jess answered on the second ring. Rachel told her about the entry in the statement. About Cody's name. About the notarized power of attorney she had never signed. Jess went quiet for a moment, then said, "We need to get a copy of that document from the bank before we say anything more. If the notarial seal is traceable, this stops being just a civil matter." Rachel said she understood. Jess said she would send a formal records request to the bank first thing in the morning, and they would go from there. Rachel stood at her window after she hung up, looking at San Antonio at night, the lights of the neighborhood, the movement on the road below the parking lot of her building. Her courtyard. Her address. Her name on the deed. The September phone call. The October call from Gary. The December visit. Sandra at the kitchen table with her reading glasses on, working through the loan documents page by page. Gary looking at the surface of the table. She had read all of those as the ordinary awkwardness of a family that did not know how to talk to each other. Standing at her window that night, she was no longer sure that was what they were. She went to her filing cabinet and started pulling documents. There was work to do. Jess sent the records request to the bank the following morning. It took just under 2 weeks to get a written response confirming that the power of attorney had been presented in person at a branch location accepted by a staff member, and that a copy had been retained in their records. When the copy arrived, the notarial seal on the document belonged to a Frank Duval, listed as a notary public operating out of a document and tax preparation service in Peoria, Illinois. A check with the Illinois Secretary of State's Notary Registry came back clear on one point: the document was not recorded in Duval's official register. Jess filed a formal complaint with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit shortly after, documenting the use of what appeared to be a forged power of attorney at a federally insured institution, potential bank fraud, potential identity fraud, federal jurisdiction on both counts. They did not hear back immediately. Federal complaints do not move on anyone's schedule but their own, and for the first week after filing there was simply silence. Rachel went to work each morning, came home each evening, and waited. The private handwriting examiner's report came in during that waiting period 10 days before the first hearing. Rachel read it at her kitchen table after dinner slowly. The examiner's conclusion was unambiguous: the signature on the promissory note had not been written by Rachel Holt. It had been executed by another person with deliberate imitation of the subject's signature. The imitation was of high quality, meaning someone had access to genuine samples and had practiced. But under detailed analysis, consistent differences emerged in 3 areas: the pressure applied through the downstrokes, the angle of inclination across the entire signature, and the terminal strokes on the closing letters. The conclusion was one sentence. The questioned signature was not produced by the named individual. Rachel added the report to the binder and went to bed. 3 days before the first hearing, Jess received word that the FBI had assigned an agent to the complaint. Special Agent Tara Simmons, Financial Crimes Unit. She had reviewed the initial filing and would be in contact. It was the first confirmation that anyone on the federal side was paying attention. Rachel noted it and kept moving. On the morning of the first hearing, she took longer than usual getting ready. She stood in her closet for a moment looking at her options. She could wear civilian clothes, which was standard for a personal legal matter. Nothing in any regulation required otherwise. She chose the dress uniform, not because protocol demanded it, but because she had spent 12 years earning the right to walk into any room in the country and have that record speak before she opened her mouth. If there was ever a room where that mattered, it was this one. When she met Jess outside the courthouse, Jess looked at the uniform and raised one eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Rachel said yes. Jess did not argue. They went in. Bexar County District Court. In the room assigned to the case was a civilian space in every sense, with benches, worn smooth fluorescent panels overhead. The smell of old paper and floor cleaner that courtrooms accumulate over decades. Rachel's parents were already seated at the plaintiff's table. Sandra in a dark blazer, an enamel pin on the lapel, a small flower design with colored stones that Rachel recognized from childhood, slightly crooked the way it always was. Gary in a dark suit that fit him across the shoulders but was a size too large through the chest. He was looking at the table. Douglas Farr sat beside them with a leather portfolio and the composed expression of a man who believed he had a workable case. Farr went first. His presentation was structured and confident. He laid out the parents' position methodically: a lifetime of financial support, an $80,000 loan at a critical moment, a promissory note executed by Rachel acknowledging the transfer. He spoke for about 12 minutes. When he finished, Jess stood. She started with the mortgage history, the VA loan origination, the 7-year savings record, every monthly payment drawn from Rachel's account, the complete absence of any external transfer from Gary or Sandra Holt at any point in the process. Not a dollar. Then, in a single sentence delivered without inflection, the private handwriting examination had determined that the signature on the promissory note was not Rachel Holt's. Farr pushed back immediately. He questioned the credentials of a privately retained examiner, the reliability of the methodology, his client's right to an independent review. He was making fair procedural arguments. Judge William Eads let him finish, then asked in a voice that carried no particular emotion, "Do you know exactly who she is?" Farr started to answer. The judge did not wait. He picked up the military ID card that Jess had submitted with Rachel's initial response filing and read it aloud. Rank Captain. Branch Judge, Advocate General's Corps, United States Army. Duty Station, Fort Sam, Houston. Decorations. 12 years of service. Law degree. He read each line at the pace of someone who intends every word to land individually. Then he set the card down on the bench and looked at Farr without adding anything. The room was completely still. Rachel stood straight and said nothing. She did not need to. The judge adjourned the case for 3 weeks, ordering a handwriting examination by a certified forensic analyst from the state lab. Farr gathered his papers. Across the room, Gary was still looking at the table. 9 days after the first hearing, Rachel was at her desk on post working through a stack of administrative law reviews when her phone buzzed. It was Jess. She stepped out into the hallway, pulling the door behind her. The corridor at Fort Sam Houston's JAG office was painted cinderblock linoleum floor, the distant smell of the mess hall, the sound of boots moving somewhere around the corner. She pressed the phone to her ear. Jess said Duvall talked. Frank Duvall had given a full statement to Agent Simmons, who had reached him the previous week. He confirmed that he had notarized the power of attorney at Cody Holt's request. He confirmed that he had known Rachel had not authorized the document. He had done it for cash paid in person, no receipt, no record. He was cooperating fully with the investigation in hopes that cooperation would count for something. There was more. Agent Simmons had established through phone records and Duvall's own account that Cody had first approached him in September, 3 months before Gary and Sandra made their December visit to San Antonio. Rachel stood in the corridor and let that settle. September. The same month Sandra had called to ask so casually whether the condo was titled only in Rachel's name. By the time that call happened, Cody had already made contact with a notary willing to falsify documents. The call was not a mother's idle curiosity. It was confirming a detail the scheme still needed. She thought about the December visit. Sandra at the kitchen table reading glasses on, working through the loan documents page by page. Gary looking at the surface of the table. The chocolate cake from the bakery. The tin of Christmas cookies. They had driven 14 hours from Peoria, and they had not come to see her. They had come to look at her paperwork in person and fill in whatever the plan still needed before the filing. She thanked Jess, went back to her desk, and finished the afternoon's work. The second hearing was in 11 days. That hearing was short and procedurally sharp. Jess submitted the new evidence in 3 pieces: the bank's written confirmation of the power of attorney incident, the Illinois notary registry showing Duval's document was never officially recorded, and formal notice that the FBI investigation was active with Duval cooperating as a material witness. Farr responded, but his voice had a different quality than it had at the first hearing, still professional, still composed, but something underneath it was careful in a way it had not been before. He asked for time to review the new materials. The judge gave it. The case was adjourned again. In the corridor afterward, Rachel was walking toward the exit when she heard steps behind her. She turned. Gary was crossing the corridor alone. Sandra was on the far side of the hallway with Farr, who was speaking to her in a low voice with the expression of someone delivering a conclusion rather than a conversation. Gary walked toward Rachel with his shoulders slightly forward, the posture of a man who had spent decades standing over machinery. He stopped 2 steps away and looked at her directly, not at the floor, not at the wall. At her face. It was the first time in either hearing he had done that. He said, "Rachel, I did not think it would go this far." She looked at him. His hands, which she had known her whole life, wide across the knuckles. With the machine shop grime worked so deep into the skin folds that it never fully washed out, no matter how many years he had been retired. His gray temples. The suit that was slightly too large. She said, "Dad, you knew. The whole time you knew." He did not say he had not. He did not say he had not understood what was happening, or that he had thought it was legal, or that he had been kept in the dark. He stood in the corridor of a county courthouse and was silent. Not the silence of someone searching for words. The silence of someone who has found them and chosen not to use them. A parent who could have said something at any point over 8 months, who could have made one phone call, asked one hard question, refused one request, and did not. That silence had a name. Rachel had just never been in a position where she could not look away from it. She said, "Go back to Mom, Dad." He stood for a moment, then turned and walked back across the corridor. Rachel watched him go, then walked out. She did not sleep much the night before the final hearing. Not because she was afraid of what would happen, she knew what would happen more or less, but because the night before something final has its own quality. A kind of interior alertness that sits between anxiety and readiness and does not let you rest the way ordinary nights do. She lay in the dark and ran through every possible shape the morning could take. What Farr would say. What the judge would do. What her mother would do. That last one she had thought about the most because she already knew the answer. Sandra did not go quiet when she was cornered. She got loud. She had always gotten loud. The question was not whether she would say something. The question was what and in front of whom. Rachel was up at 5:30. She dressed in full Army dress uniform again, the same deliberate choice she had made for the first hearing for the same reason. She looked at herself in the bathroom mirror for a moment before she left. Captain Holt. 12 years. Today is the last day of this. Then she got in her car and drove to Bexar County. At Fort Sam Houston, her unit was marking Veterans Day formation remarks from the commander lunch at the dining facility the way they did every year. She had taken leave for the day and explained she had a personal legal matter. Her supervisor had not asked for details. She drove past the base on her way into the city and did not stop. The courthouse corridor when she arrived already had the feeling of something in its final stage. Farr was near the window at the far end speaking to Sandra in a low voice with the expression of a man closing out a file. Sandra's enamel pin was crooked on her blazer lapel, the same small flower it had always been. Gary was sitting on a wooden bench along the wall, forearms on his knees, looking at the floor. When Rachel came through the door, Sandra looked up. Rachel met her eyes and held them, no challenge in it, no satisfaction, just held them. Sandra looked away first. Gary did not look up at all. In the courtroom, Farr rose and delivered the withdrawal in careful professional language built for the record. He cited the State Forensic Lab's handwriting report which had come back the previous week, confirming the private examiner's findings. Exactly the signature on the promissory note was not Rachel Holt's. He spoke of his client's decision to voluntarily withdraw the claim in full, of reconsidering the weight of the evidence, of a desire to resolve the matter without further proceedings. The words were correct. Everyone in the room understood what they meant. Judge Eads listened without interrupting. Then Sandra stood up. Farr reached for her arm. She was already speaking. Her voice did not shake. That was the thing Rachel would carry longest, not the words themselves but the steadiness of the voice delivering them. "She's nothing but a worthless daughter," said, "the way you state a fact you have no doubt about. We gave everything to her. She went to the Army, she moved to Texas, she calls once a week, comes back once a year. Let this court know what kind of person she is. Let everyone know." The room went still in the way rooms go still when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. Farr closed his eyes. Gary did not move. The bailiff near the door straightened almost imperceptibly. Jess, standing beside Rachel, did not change her expression by a fraction. Rachel stood with her hands at her sides and her chin level. It was the posture she had been trained to hold when everything in a situation is pressing against you and the correct response is to not give any of it an inch. She had stood this way in difficult proceedings and command briefings that went sideways. In a dozen situations over 12 years where the professional thing and the human thing were in direct conflict and the professional thing had to win. She stood that way now. Judge Eads looked at Sandra for a long moment. Not with visible judgment, not with theater. He simply looked at her, the way someone looks at a thing that has made itself clear. Then he turned back to the bench and said in the same even voice he used for everything else. "The court accepts the withdrawal of the claim. This case is dismissed." He paused. "The court further notes that materials transmitted to federal investigators in connection with this matter will continue to be examined in the normal course, regardless of the disposition of the civil case." He stood. Everyone stood. The session was closed. Sandra sat down. The certainty that had held her upright drained out of her posture slowly, and what remained was just a woman in a dark blazer with a crooked pin on the lapel, sitting in a courtroom where she had just lost everything she had come to take. Rachel was halfway down the corridor when she heard footsteps behind her moving faster than a walk. She turned. Gary was coming toward her, slightly out of breath. He stopped near the exit doors and looked at her directly with something in his face that had been worked toward over the days between hearings. He said her name. Then he said, "I listened to your mother. I listened to Cody. I did not protect you. I went against you instead. That was wrong." Rachel looked at him and said quietly, "You knew, Dad. Your silence was part of it." He did not deny it. He stood and was silent one final time. She said, "Go back to Mom." No anger in it. No coldness. The way you say something that has reached its natural end and does not require a response. He nodded once and turned and walked back the way he had come. She pushed through the exit door. November sunlight hit her face sharper than she expected for that time of year, carrying actual warmth. She stopped on the top step and closed her eyes. Just for a moment. The city moved around her, traffic voices somewhere below, the distant sound of aircraft from the direction of the base. Somewhere across San Antonio her unit was gathered for the holiday. Here on the courthouse steps in her dress uniform on the 11th of November, something that had been held tight inside her chest for the better part of a year began slowly and without drama to release. It is October now. 8 months since the courthouse steps, 8 months since the case was dismissed, and the November sunlight hit her face and something started letting go. Rachel's condo in Stone Oak looks different than it did a year ago, not dramatically but in the way a place looks when someone has stopped bracing for something and started living instead. New paint on the living room walls, a warm off-white that holds the afternoon light differently than the builder beige it replaced. Navy curtains in the bedroom, heavy enough to block the morning sun. A small round cactus in a clay pot on the windowsill by the kitchen, impractical for someone who travels on short notice, but alive, which is what she wanted. She makes coffee each morning and stands at that window and watches the neighborhood come to life. The October light in San Antonio is dry and gold and unhurried, the heat finally gone from it. She stands there with her coffee, and she thinks, this is mine. It was always mine. No one took it. No one will. Cody was sentenced in July. 3 years probation, a $50,000 fine, convictions on forgery and federal bank fraud. His defense had argued that he acted out of family loyalty and had not fully grasped the legal weight of his actions. The judge was not persuaded. A claims adjuster with 2 years of paralegal coursework, who personally presents a forged notarized document at a bank branch window, knows at a basic level what he is doing. Frank Duval's notarial commission was revoked by the state of Illinois in August following a disciplinary review. 20 years of practice ended in a single administrative proceeding. For a notary, falsifying a document for cash is not a lapse in judgment. It is a destruction of the only thing the position is built on. As of the time of this telling, Douglas Farr's bar complaint is still under review by the Texas State Bar. Whether it results in a formal sanction or a finding of insufficient evidence, Rachel does not know yet. Her parents were not charged. The FBI's assessment was that Cody had designed and executed the scheme, and that Gary and Sandra had been beneficiaries who may not have fully understood the criminal character of the methods being used on their behalf. The federal investigation technically remains open. Rachel does not know what that will ultimately mean for her parents, if anything. She has stopped trying to predict it. She is their daughter, which remains the most complicated thing she has ever been asked to be. Sandra called in August on a Sunday evening. Rachel was on her couch with a book when the phone vibrated beside her. She looked at her mother's name on the screen for a long time before she answered. Sandra said, "Rachel, we're sorry." 2 words and then silence. Rachel waited for what comes after words like that, the specific thing named plainly, an acknowledgement of what it had cost. Something that showed the words were attached to understanding rather than just to the desire to be forgiven. Nothing came. The silence on the other end was the sound of someone who had reached the edge of what they were capable of and stopped there. Rachel said, "I heard you, Mom." Then she put the phone down. Not in anger, not in triumph. She put it down because "we're sorry" without anything behind it does not close what it is trying to close. Some distances do not get covered in 2 words. She knows that. She has made her peace with knowing it. In September, her commanding officer called her into his office and told her in the direct way that passes for warmth in that building, that the recommendation for her promotion to major had been signed and was moving through the approval process. She said yes, sir, saluted and walked out. In the hallway she stopped alone and let herself smile, the real one, not the professional one. Major Holt. It sounded like something that had been waiting for her to catch up to it. In a drawer, she keeps a photograph from her childhood, 4th of July, Peoria, Illinois. She is maybe 5 or 6 years old, in a red zip-up jacket slightly too big for her, holding a small paper flag up in her right hand. She is not looking at the camera. She is looking sideways at something outside the frame, something large and undefined and apparently worth her full attention. Her father is visible in the background, slightly out of focus. He is watching her. His expression is open in a way she has not seen on his face since unguarded quiet, carrying something that looks very much like pride. The kind he never found words for and eventually stopped trying to find. She looks at that girl sometimes and thinks about everything she did not know yet. Did not know about law school or the JAG Corps or Fort Sam Houston or 12 years of work that added up to something real. Did not know about the courtroom or the forged note or what it would feel like to stand straight in a dress uniform while her own mother said the worst thing she could think to say. Did not know that the people standing closest to you can also be the ones who decide one day that what you built belongs partly to them. That girl was looking at something out there in the middle distance, something she could not name yet, and moving toward it. She got there. Not the way anyone else mapped it out. Her own way, her own work, her own name on the deed. So here is what this story leaves with you, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Rachel did not fight back because she had something to prove. She fought back because she had spent 12 years building something real, and she knew exactly what it was worth, and she refused to let the word family be used as a reason to hand it over. If you had been in her position, if the people who raised you filed a lawsuit built on a forged document and counted on your love for them to make you fold, do you think you could have held the line the way she did, or would that one word have been enough to make you give in? Leave your answer in the comments. It matters more than you might think.